Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Steve Keller. I'm the program developer for Substance, formerly known as Drug Free Kids Canada. We will be starting the webinar in just a moment or two here. We're just waiting for some more of our attendees to come in. I know we've got about 25 registered for tonight, and in the interest of time, we'll make sure that we get started here in just another minute or so. Now, while we're waiting, I would like to take a moment just to welcome you all once again and let you know this presentation is designed to be interactive. It will be recorded so that you have a copy for your own records. And if you have any questions or comments or concerns during the webinar, if you're looking for any more information or have any questions about the nature of our program, you can feel free to enter it into the chat panel or into the Q&A session, and either I or our outreach officer, Sarah Keeman, who's joined me this evening, will be able to take those questions as we go along. Now, see, it's 9:01. I'm sure people will be joining here in the next couple of minutes. So while they do, I will get us started. Once again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Steve Keller. Like I said, I am here today to speak with you about one of the most common substances that teens report trying and or, using in Canada. Tonight, we're going to talk about cannabis. Now, this workshop is going to cover quite a bit of ground, including exploring the backgrounds and different types of cannabis products. We're going to clarify myths and misconceptions that people may have about cannabis use. We will explore the possible harms or health risks associated with cannabis. And finally, discuss strategies involving lowering harm and helping us to make safe and informed decisions around substance use. Now, before we get started today, I would like to inform you a little bit about our vision. Now, here at Substance, our vision is to ensure that young people are able to live their lives free of problematic and substance use and addiction. Now, what does it mean to live free of problematic use? The idea of problematic is really the most important part of this statement. In the past, previous sort of educational programming around substance use really focused on abstinence approaches primarily, the just say no model, if you will. They promoted the idea that the only acceptable or safe behavior around substance use was to simply not use. There is certainly something to be said about abstinence, and that we know people that don't use substances are not going to be harmed by their effects. However, we do also understand that substance use is a choice, and our program respects that agency of choice that Canadians have. We're not here to pass judgment or to treat people differently based on whether or not they use. Perhaps they've experienced harms. Perhaps there's people listening tonight or watching the recording here that have either experienced harms as a result of substance use or know someone who has. Our vision is not to make sure that no one will ever use. Our vision is to try to prevent people from experiencing harm and to provide skills and strategies and knowledge of how it is that we may be able to reduce some of the potential negative outcomes that can arise as a result of substance use, particularly for youth, but for families and communities as a whole. And for that end, our program offers free workshops and webinars, virtually and in person, all across Canada, including the one that we are doing here today on cannabis, which leads us into the very topic itself. What is cannabis? Now, before we get into an operational definition, and before we start speaking about what the research says about cannabis, I'm always curious to know what the audience already knows. So you can put this into the chat panel. You can think about it and reflect on it yourself. But I want you to think about this sort of as we go along. What have you heard about cannabis prior to tonight, prior to, seeing this presentation, perhaps accessing our resources at talksubstance.org? What do you know about what happens when people consume cannabis? How do people feel when they use it? What might be some of the possible health risks or benefits that you've heard of? And while you think about this, we will be discussing many of these topics today. Many of the questions that you have, we will endeavor to answer. If I miss anything, please feel free to let me know after the conclusion of the workshop. If I miss any topics, I will be around to take questions from anyone else in the audience, and hopefully I'll be able to get to them as we go along too. Now, before we start talking about the substance use itself and what we understand about the knowledge of cannabis, one of the things I like to start off whenever I'm having a conversation around any substance, be that cannabis, alcohol, opioids, vaping, hallucinogens, I like to ask, why do we think that youth use substances? What is it that they're trying to feel? When we look at cannabis, what are they trying to gain from using cannabis? I'll put this to our audience here and see what you think. And you can put your responses in the chat panel if you'd like. While you're thinking about it, I will give you some of the things that I've heard from audiences before. We hear people talking about wanting to fit in. We hear people talking about wanting to feel better. We talk about people, when I did this presentation yesterday, there were people talking about saying they didn't want to feel anything. And that's why they use. Now, there's a lot of factors that play into substance use, what it is that teens are trying to feel. And according to research that we've seen from the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addictions, the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, CAMH, multiple other highly regarded and reputed resources, as well as our own research from our tracking studies over the last number of years. Some of the things that we see teens try to feel when they use substances includes curiosity, relaxation, joy, pleasure, feeling accepted, and for some, simply feeling better. And there's something to be said about each of these things here. And I see one of the responses in the chat panel says they're trying to fit in with a group. Absolutely, that's that idea of acceptance. Youth may turn to using substances because they see other people that they look up to or people that they identify with using. So they use to try to feel included, have that sense of what we would call peer selection. There's the idea of curiosity. If a youth sees someone else using, they don't know what it's like. They've seen it depicted in media. They've heard about it online. They hear about it talked about at school. They want to know what it's like. In fact, curiosity is often the most common reason that many people try substances, which is a very natural emotion. Think about the last 12 months of your own life. How many times have you tried something new? It could be a new restaurant, could be new fashion, could be a new movie, could be a new video game. Curiosity is a human emotion. And substance use is really no exception on that topic. There are those that will try simply because they're curious. Now, if we understand the reasons that people do use substances, it becomes equally important to understand why they may choose not to. Why do they abstain? Why do they say no? One of the things about abstinence programming in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s was that most of it was actually found to not really impact youth substance use decisions. And part of the reason was many people were already not going to use substances, and they didn't need someone yelling at them not to use in order to not use. So the question becomes, if not the DARE campaign, if not the Bravo program, if not those abstinence-only programs, what is it then that prevents teens from using substances? What do we think? It's funny. I do presentations for teens and young adults all across Canada. I've been doing it for about 10 years. And sometimes when I ask about substance use, I might ask teens, what happens when you use cannabis? Talk about alcohol. What happens when you drink? And it's funny. They always want to tell me stories about the parties they go to, the Friday night party, the Saturday night party, the field party, the after party, the social gathering that they go to. They always want to tell me about those highs and the excitement they get out of impairment. But they never really want to talk about the morning after, do they? There's factors that play against their decisions to use. Some say they're afraid to be caught. They don't want to get in trouble. Some say there's health risks to be considered. Some don't want to think about the negative experiences. For everyone that's used cannabis and talked about the laughs and the good times that they know others who've used cannabis and had mind-shredding panic attacks. Both of those things can happen as a result. It's similar to the conversation around alcohol. There are people that drink because they enjoy the Saturday nights, but there are those who don't because they don't want to deal with the Sunday morning after. There's the judgment from peers, the personal values, and the lack of interest. When you are working with youth, and we ask them often why it is they use substances, sometimes it helps to ask the ones that don't what factors play into their decision not to. And it's not to question them. It's not to make them doubt their own values. It's to make them reaffirm them. If youth point out that they don't want to use substances because they're taking care of their personal health, if they don't want to use substances because they've seen adverse effects or harms, that's an important lesson that they learned. And recognizing that and acknowledging that and showing that they are demonstrating a great deal of maturity and health and personal care in making that decision is a great conversation that can help you reaffirm positive values without having to get into the left side of this conversation. On the other hand, if you do have youth that are using substances, those that are using can sometimes be asked this follow-up question. Why did they start using? And why are they using now? You see, if someone's reasons for using substances have changed, it might be time for them to question what it is they're really getting from substance use. And if we use cannabis as an example, one of the most common reasons that young people cite for using cannabis is to cope with their mental health. They talk about issues with stress, they talk about issues with anxiety, they talk about issues with depression. And we're actually going to talk about all of that a little bit later. But the question is, if they started using cannabis to alleviate feelings of stress and panic attacks in grade 9, in grade 10, if grade 11 rolls around and grade 12 rolls around, and they're still having panic attacks, they're still having insomnia, they're still struggling with their mental health, and they're using cannabis, what is the cannabis doing for them? It might have helped in the beginning for them. Why isn't it now? And if it's not helping now, if the very things that they're trying to alleviate are continuing or worsening, it might be time for them to speak with a healthcare provider. If a teen mentions that they use cannabis because their friends use, if they use to socialize, it's a fair point. There are many teens that start using cannabis just as other drugs because they were partying with friends who were using. They were hanging out with friends who were using. That's peer selection. They looked for a group of people around them that had an interest they wanted to partake in and got into that. Now, if 12 months later, 24 months later, 3 years later, 2 years later, we see a youth that's using cannabis with their friends who, after 2 years, is now using on their own, the question becomes, what are they getting out of using? It used to be social aspects, but that's not there anymore. If they're avoiding hanging out with their friends and isolating to use cannabis, then the point of reflection for them becomes, what is it I'm actually getting out of using? Food for thought. Now, throughout the presentation, I do like to have live polls. I have some multiple choice questions here. I'm going to ask the audience. You can feel free to toss your answer into the chat panel. And the first question I have for you is this. Cannabis has been used around the world for thousands of years. For which of the following purposes? Is it A, recreational use, for pleasure, for ritualistic use? Is it medical use to treat chronic pain, reducing swelling, treating nausea? Is it industrial use? Do we make cannabis into rope? Do we make it into clothing? Or is it all of the above? What is the use of cannabis? What do we think? Your audience moment. I see people saying recreational, some people saying medical. What do we think? All of them? The answer is actually all of the above. You see, many people know the recreational uses of cannabis. We know cannabis was legalized for recreational use in 2018. Medically, cannabis was legalized in 2001. But if you're ever familiar with a product called hemp, hemp is actually cannabis without THC in it, or I believe it's less than 0.3% THC. We use hemp because the cannabis plant itself is actually quite tensily strong. We've seen it used in the past in ancient cultures in China, Greece, Rome, Egypt, not only to be used for rituals or spiritual sort of connectivity, but for medical applications to treat minor nausea. We've also seen cannabis used for things like creating bricks, paper, textiles, rope. In the Western Hemisphere, cannabis was not only used for consumption, but it was used to create fibers, create papers, and it was even used as trading currency. And the reason I like to bring this up is sometimes when we talk about substances with youth, we get caught up in the morality of substances, that they're a good or a bad thing. Drugs are not bad. They're not good either. They have uses, they have applications, they can be helpful. They can also be dangerous, they can be harmful, and they can be risky. Pointing out the multiple uses of cannabis points out that it has utility. It doesn't make cannabis somehow morally better because we used it for these things. Just like cannabis's harms do not make it morally worse because we use. And taking that morality out of the conversation can help youth feel a little bit more comfortable and approach it less from an emotional perspective that can lead to confrontation and make the conversation a little bit more logical and a little bit more educational. And for some people that are listening tonight, if any of you work in the educational sector, being able to sometimes step away from the emotion for a bit and just talk about something as a concept can create a little bit more dialogue with the youth than making them feel attacked or judged if they use. That's why we take morality out of the conversation. Now, cannabis contains about 400 different chemicals, including what we know as cannabinoids. And one of them, which we're going to talk about a little more later, is called delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And if you don't want to remember that, just call it THC. THC is what we know that causes impairment in a person when they use. And it can actually create different effects for different people. One of the things that makes cannabis so complicated to talk about is classifying it is not as simple as many other substances. You see, when we talk about alcohol, last month we did a national webinar on alcohol. We know that alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. Next month, we're doing a presentation on opioids. We understand that opioids play on receptors in the brain and in the gut to sort of prevent vomit or prevent diarrhea, but can also prevent breathing, which is where the harm of opioids come in. We know that caffeine is used as a stimulant. We know that tranquilizers are used as sedatives. The problem with cannabis is it can have stimulating effects. It can increase energy. For other people, it can decrease energy. For some people, it can make them feel relaxed and happy. For others, it can make them feel anxious and paranoid. For some people, it can actually take away nausea. For others, it can make nausea worse. And there are so many factors that play into why cannabis affects us differently. It can be our age, as we know that people under the age of 25 are more susceptible to harm than people over the age of 25. It could be our experience with the product. New users are more potentially at risk of certain harms. However, long-term users may be at risk of harms that new users aren't. More on that later. Could be the product used, could be how it's consumed, could be a person's medical history. It could be their mood. You can have a different high if you're in a good mood versus if you're in a bad mood. You can have a different high if you're tired versus if you're wide awake. You can have a different high if you're hungry. You can have a different high if you're anxious, depending on why you're anxious. Because the brain and cannabis do not interact in a perfectly linear, always consistent manner. That's why two different people can't base their experiences off of each other. And no one should ever do that. Because one teen, one youth, one adult may experience very little or no harms as a result of cannabis, but the person next to them could suffer significant harm even from the very first use. And to sort of further this idea of cannabis having different effects, one of the things I like to show during this presentation is a PSA that was created by our partners over at Savoir Media. It's going to be just a little under 2 minutes. I'm going to play it here for the audience. Hope you enjoy it.
When you think of a person who uses cannabis, you probably don't see them as stressed out or sad. You imagine someone chill, who likes having fun, and sharing really deep ideas.
Oh, so he's called Mickey Mouse because he's a mouse, right?
But does using cannabis always increase feelings of pleasure?
Mind-blowing! Everything you need to know about substances.
Does cannabis increase feelings of pleasure? THC, the main psychoactive compound in cannabis, imitates molecules that are naturally present in the brain. THC binds to receptors that increase the activity of certain neurons, including those that produce
Dopamine, man.
That's the hormone that's typically associated with pleasure. But the emotions we feel depend on where the dopamine is produced in the brain. Studies have shown that THC increases dopamine production in a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. That's where the brain's reward system is located.
Woohoo! Party time!
It's a region with many receptors sensitive to THC. But these receptors are also found in another part of the brain called the amygdala, which processes emotions like fear and anxiety.
What the hell was that? Mickey Mouse?
Depending on how a person feels, the strength of the dose, how often they use, and how predisposed they are to mental disorders, they could have a completely different reaction to someone taking the exact same thing. There's no denying that cannabis can increase feelings of pleasure, but it can also increase feelings of anxiety and panic.
But why would a mouse wear shorts and not a t-shirt?
One thing's for sure, the effects of cannabis are unpredictable.
I always enjoy showing the little Savoir Media PSAs. And if you ever want to check out more of them, you can always visit our website, talksubstance.org. We've got about a dozen others. It does help to really point out the fact that cannabis lacks what I like to call a pattern of effect. Because when we speak with youth, this can create a lot of confusion in the dialogue that we have. If I'm doing a presentation for teens, I might ask them how many of them know someone that uses cannabis because it helps them sleep at night. Half the room will put their hands up. I say, how many of you know someone that can't smoke weed because it keeps them up all night? The other half of the room puts their hands up. I ask how many of you know someone that uses cannabis medically. Several people put their hands up because the medical use of cannabis is preventing nausea and vomiting. Other people may say, well, that makes no sense. People that I know smoke weed and throw up all the time. Cannabis lacks a pattern of effect based on so many factors. And trying to say there's a one size fits all is not that simple. That's why it's important to keep up on the research of cannabis and to learn as much as possible. And to help with that, here are some of the things that we do know about cannabis. We know cannabis can be consumed in a variety of ways. We have dried leaf cannabis. These are your pipes, your bongs, your joints, your spliffs. This is burning the dried leaf plant itself and then inhaling the vapors in order to get a certain effect. The most natural way to use does not necessarily mean the most safe. Very important. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There are vape products similar to nicotine vapes, for which we have a national webinar coming up in October. Cannabinoids are extracted and processed with e-liquids that are then heated and inhaled. Now, they may not be as natural as, say, dried leaf product due to the chemicals that are added, but that doesn't necessarily make them any more or less harmful. What does tend to make them more risky is the elevated level of THC. On that later. There's cannabis edibles, food and drink that contains cannabis. These are processed differently than other methods of cannabis use, and because of that, can have completely different effects. They take a lot longer to take effect. Their effects can be even stronger when they come on, and they can last 2 to 4 times longer than a person who smokes or vapes cannabis. They're your concentrates and your extracts. Vapes are actually an example of a concentrate. These are products that involve actually pulling cannabis away from its cannabinoids and getting rid of the undesired plant material to be left with a stronger and more potent product. You may have heard people talk about things like shatter or butters or cannabis oils or honey crisp. These are examples of extracts. THC has been pulled off the plant. It creates this sticky sort of a resin that's then processed and pressurized, usually through physical sifting, cold water, or chemicals or gases like propane or carbon dioxide to really pressurize the product and create these strong extracts. There's tinctures and sprays that can be added onto any product. They can be sprayed onto foods. They can be sprayed just underneath the tongue. They can be put on breath strips. Then there's your topical creams, forms of extracted cannabis used with prepared with oils, waxes, alcohols. These are your body butters, your body lotions, your bath bombs that you see mixed with cannabis. And finally, there's THC pouches, which have really hit the market in the last couple of years. Similar to a nicotine pouch, the THC itself is extracted, mixed with other certain pH balancers and whatnot, and then placed behind the lower lip. And those balancers then sort of lift the bloodstream closer to the lip and the gum line so that THC passes directly into the bloodstream. Now, we talk about different products. We talk about why people use. We talk about the effects they have. Well, how many people are using? What percentage of high school-age youth in Canada report using cannabis in the past 12 months? This being according to the Canadian Student Alcohol and Drug Survey, most recently reported in 2025. Do we think it's 10, 18, 53, or 81%? I'll give you guys a moment to think about this one. Now, while you're thinking, when I do these presentations and I ask youth this question, they will most often guess the bottom two numbers. They will guess 53%, they will guess 81%, and they'll tell me everyone I know uses. The answer has been less than 20% for the last 12 years, the last 14 years. We didn't see a big shoot up in cannabis numbers after legalization for underage youth. We did see a significant increase for college university students, for seniors, for other reasons that you can talk about another day. But youth under the legal age, that number is held consistent since about 2014. The reason that we often think it's higher, the reason that we tend to think it's higher is that when I ask this question, we often tend to become a victim of what we know as a confirmation bias. We start to think of all of the examples of times we interact with youth that are using. We talk with youth about using. We see them using. I did a presentation in Western Ontario. I went and visited a high school. I saw about 1,200 students. And I remember on the way to doing the presentation, I walked by this bathroom, and this group of students came out, 5 or 6. And I'm walking with the school's administrator, and they look at me and they kind of roll their eyes. They're like, this is why we have you come in and talk about drugs. Everyone in my school is vaping in the bathroom. Everyone's using drugs in the bathroom. I said, everyone, eh? Yeah. I said, well, you said you have 1,147 students here. I said, and 5 of them just came out. I said, that's a pretty big number. I said, I don't think the other 1,142 are in there, right? Otherwise, they kind of have like that clown car set up in the bathroom. I don't really think it's going on. The reason I bring this up is that we often think of all of the examples of this happening, which makes the number feel more inflated than it actually is. 1 in 5 teens use cannabis, which is actually fairly consistent with the national average of Canadians over the age of 15 overall. That still equates to about 7 to 8 million people. That is still a lot of people, but it's not as many as we think. And the majority of teens don't actually use. And sometimes reminding teens of that is a great way to harken back to what I spoke to earlier, that their decision to use needs to be based on their own situation. Because if they're really basing it on what's going on around them, they actually wouldn't use because the majority of people don't use. That said, we know cannabis is the second most commonly consumed substance by youth in Canada after alcohol. Alcohol is about 2 to 4 times higher, depending on where you're looking. The average age of first time use is around 14. Now, the rate of use also increases with age. There may be people here that work with 12, 13, 11-year-olds. They might say, well, not many of them use. Only about 3% of them report past year use. By grade 12, that number inflates to about 39%. So there's a wide variance there. The overall average, grade 7 to 12, is 18, but there's a wide variance there. This is why it's important to dig a little deeper than just seeing the first number. But even at its max, even at grade 12, that is still below the majority. The majority of teens don't use. Vaping cannabis is the most common method of use, followed by dried leaf and edibles. And we also know that youth report similar rates of using cannabis before driving or being a passenger with a driver who's used as those who report doing so with alcohol. Which brings up the importance of having conversations around substance impaired driving and reminding youth that that includes cannabis. When cannabis was made legal, about a quarter of Canadian adults actually believed that cannabis had no impact on driving whatsoever. However, research from trauma centers across Canada taken just a year ago on about 8,300 different collision victims and injured people that have come out of car crashes actually found that cannabis, not alcohol, was the most common substance found in dead and injured drivers in Canada. It wasn't alcohol. So it becomes very important to have the conversation around impaired driving based around cannabis, just as much as it is on drinking. Now, I've spoken a couple times about cannabinoids, and I've talked about those chemicals that we see in cannabis. And there are hundreds that we could get into. The two that tend to be the most important to understand are THC and CBD. Let's start with THC. THC is that impairing substance in cannabis. Like I said, this is the psychoactive part. It's what changes how we think, how we act, and how we see the world. The more THC that a person uses, the stronger the product is going to be. And this is very important because, again, when we look at different methods of cannabis use, THC potency ranges widely. If we look at cannabis sprays and tinctures, THC in those is generally only about 1 to 3%. If we look at joints and pipes and bongs, THC can be anywhere from 15 to 30%. And if we look at vapes, vapes can be up to 97% THC. This would be like comparing light beer to rubbing alcohol or light beer to spirits and saying, well, they're all alcohol. But they're not. The stronger the potency, the greater the risk of adverse effects. And THC content in cannabis products has been increasing over the last 40 years, from 1% in the 1980s to 90% in vapes and extracts today. Now, the other cannabinoid we tend to talk about quite a bit in cannabis is CBD, or cannabidiol. Now, CBD has been researched a lot more for its sort of medical applications and potential medical uses. Some research suggests that it may mitigate or smooth out some of the effects of THC, particularly if we have lower amounts of THC in the product. And here in Canada, CBD-based cannabis products with low amounts of THC may be prescribed to treat certain symptoms, including swelling and chronic pain for people living with multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, advanced cancer, chronic pain from a significant injury or trauma, treating nausea or vomiting for people going through chemotherapy or radiation, as well as increasing appetite, again, for people going through chemo, radiation, or dealing with significant eating disorders. Because some research has suggested that cannabis can reduce inflammation, it can slow down and calm down the muscles in the digestive system to actually prevent nausea, and it can make people hungry. If you don't believe me, have a conversation with someone about the munchies when it comes to cannabis. You'll find examples of this. It has a medical purpose. Who knew? True or false? If a person smokes or vapes cannabis with THC, they can get high in less than 2 minutes. Someone goes to a party on a Friday night. They smoke a bowl. 2 minutes later, they say, I'm feeling it already. And their buddies laugh and they go, no, you're not. You can't feel it that fast. What do you think? Is this true or is this false? What do we think? Survey says it is indeed true. Absolutely, it is. Now, cannabis vape products, I mentioned this a moment ago, they're the most common way that teens currently use cannabis. Their potency can be up to 90%. The effects are felt within seconds. And the reason for that is when a person consumes cannabis and consumes THC by breathing it in, the THC travels straight to the lungs. The lungs very quickly absorb that THC, pump it to the heart, as it would with oxygenated blood, and the heart then pumps that THC directly up to the brain. This can get a person impaired within 30 seconds to 2 minutes, and it will peak between about 30 minutes to 2 hours. Now, the effects wear off after about 6 to 12 hours. And the thing about THC is the more that you use, the greater your risk of cannabis poisoning. This can include symptoms like anxiety, panic attacks, heart palpitation, fever, nausea, vomiting, delusions, psychotic episodes, particularly in vulnerable people. People that have a medical history or a family history of conditions like psychosis and schizophrenia are at a greater risk of psychotic episodes. However, those that have significant history of trauma in their life, young people, particularly those under the age of 25 whose brains are still developing, people experiencing issues with sleep, with insomnia, people that are dealing with being overworked, overwhelmed with life, they may be more susceptible to psychotic episodes as well, and using cannabis may push that further along. True or false? When smoking cannabis, holding your breath, hold in the smoke longer, will get you more impaired. Is this true or is this false? What do we think? What do we think? Survey says the answer here is this is indeed false. This is a common misconception, especially among teens. They somehow believe, holding your breath while smoking weed is going to get you more high. They talk about getting a head rush, getting dizzy, their face getting hot, and feeling more energized. Now, in reality, this isn't caused by trapping the smoke in their lungs. This is actually caused by another effect that happens when you hold your breath, which is cutting off oxygen. The symptoms they're experiencing are the body's natural response to a lack of air. Their lungs will absorb over 95% of the THC that they consume within the first 2 seconds that it travels through the airways, making it absolutely pointless for someone to hold their breath while smoking. And the problem with that is that holding in that cannabis smoke, particularly from dried leaf product, is allowing burnt plant material, which contains many carcinogenic and infectious chemicals, to sit and rest in the lungs. So when we look at dried leaf products, similar to vapes because we inhale them, they take effect quickly, they peak quickly, they wear off between 6 to 12 hours with residuals lasting a few more hours. The reason these are seen as more physically risky is that the burnt plant material can contain many chemicals that are also found in tobacco. Things like carbon monoxide from the smoke, cyanide, hydrocarbons, ammonia, tar, benzene, and many other chemicals that are found naturally in soil that the cannabis plant absorbs. Some of these chemicals and compounds have been linked to various types of lung diseases, including cancer. And burnt plant material has been linked to lung infections, can complicate symptoms of bronchitis and asthma, and in the long term can cause a buildup of tar, which is connected to COPD in the lungs, not unlike that found in tobacco smoke. Now, what about edibles? If we know smoking and vaping has all these risks for the lungs, well, shouldn't eating them be safer? Well, edible cannabis works a little bit differently. Edible potency is based on how much THC is in the product. The effects are a lot slower with an edible. They tend to be felt usually within about 30 minutes to 2 hours. For some people, they can take 4 hours. The peak of cannabis impairment with an edible can hit anywhere between 2 to 12 hours and can take up to 24 hours to wear off. The reason for this is that the body has to process THC in the liver, and that's when it's finally released through the blood, and the effects are starting to be felt. This process can take several hours and wear off over a slow period of time. And the problem is, because edibles are so slow to take effect, they tend to actually result in more harms for youth and novice users. The reason being, if they've smoked or vaped before, someone will feel an effect quite quickly. But when they take an edible, they don't feel the effect right away. So they think it doesn't work. So they take another one. 20 minutes go by, they take another one. 5 minutes go by, they take two more. And at 2 hours, they're as high as the person that smoked weed with them. But they're only high from the first one. Then the second kicks in, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and suddenly they're teetering more towards cannabis poisoning because they overconsumed without realizing that they needed to wait. This is why, since legalization, one of the more common sort of catchphrases or slogans when it comes to harm reduction with cannabis is start low and go slow. Look for low potency cannabis products and start with a small amount and wait to see how you feel. This is especially important with vaping and especially important with edibles. One of the common reasons that youth cite for cannabis use is self-medication, to feel better. They use for a medical purpose. They say that they're trying to alleviate or cure some kind of medical problem in their life. In fact, there has actually been various research that's looked into this. A 2024 CCSA report on cannabis use estimated that about 13% of Canadians claim to use cannabis for a medical purpose, which begs the question, how many Canadians between the ages of 16 to 24 that report using cannabis for a medical purpose do so without any documentation from a healthcare professional? Is it 30, 42, 71, or 95%? This according to the 2024 Canadian Cannabis Survey. 30%. What do we think? The answer is 95%. Overall, 3/4 of Canadians overall do not actually have medical documentation to use cannabis for a medical purpose. But when we specifically look at people under the age of 25 who report using cannabis medically at a higher rate than any other demographic, they report at a much lower rate of actually seeking treatment. So let's take a look at some of the things that they're trying to treat with cannabis. Now, before I get into this, I do want to take a moment and note very importantly, this is not a presentation that is trying to discredit potential medical application of cannabis. That is not what I'm doing. Cannabis has a position in medicine. We see this, we see it being researched. There is potential there, and more research is needed. The issue is if someone treats cannabis as a recreational product and tries to use it for a medical purpose, meaning that they don't speak with a healthcare provider, meaning that they don't understand their own medical profile, they may be more at risk of experiencing negative effects or at the very least, not improving the effects they're trying to work on. So let's take a look at what some of those self-medical uses are that youth talk about. In Canada, 53% say that they self-medicate with cannabis to treat depression. Same amount say they do so for anxiety, panic attacks, and OCD. Keep in mind, people can cite multiple reasons. That's why this doesn't total 100, total a little more. 45% say they treat insomnia and sleeping problems with smoking weed. 38% say they do it to treat their symptoms of ADHD. And 27% say they use to treat acute pain, and 23% say they use to treat chronic pain. Which begs the question, what does the research actually say about these things if we're hearing testimonial from people that say they help? Well, first of all, we know that 53% of youth say they use cannabis medically to alleviate symptoms of depression. The research doesn't necessarily agree with this. Early research after legalization and ensuing research has actually looked at the way that cannabis interacts with dopamine in the brain, which it can cause a spike in dopamine, which can create feelings of pleasure and euphoria and excitement. However, regular use of doing this can actually make a person more tolerant to those effects, meaning that they need more cannabis to feel the same way that they did, and they start to have a harder time feeling joy when they don't use. Second, research into the interactions between cannabis and serotonin, which is another neurotransmitter that regulates and balances mood, has suggested that early use of cannabis may increase the body's ability to respond to serotonin, which may alleviate symptoms of depression. However, that response becomes a bell curve, and over time, their responses get worse to serotonin, which can increase vulnerability to symptoms of depression. This is not to say that cannabis causes depression, but it is not to say that cannabis cures depression. Depression is an issue that often requires medical intervention, social work support, and identifying root causes of why the individual is feeling the way that they are. Turning to a substance to try to alleviate those symptoms without identifying the underlying mechanisms will more often just allow the condition to continue to grow. 53% of youth that use cannabis medically say they do so to alleviate symptoms of anxiety and panic attacks. Well, we know that one of the side effects of elevated THC is actually paranoia and panic attacks and anxiety, which would kind of be like taking a pain-killing medication for a headache and finding out that the side effect is getting a headache. And what I mean by this is that there is no research that actually conclusively states that cannabis alleviates anxiety. In fact, most research actually shows that the regular use of cannabis makes youth more susceptible to paranoia and response to stimuli which may cause feelings of anxiety. In fact, youth that experience cannabis related harms are 4 times more likely to develop, not start with, but develop new or worsening anxiety and mood disorders. 45% of youth say they use cannabis medically to treat insomnia. Well, we know that cannabis use can cause heart palpitations, fever, nausea, and restlessness that may contribute to sleepless nights. And for those that use cannabis and do fall asleep, research from multiple sleep clinics has actually shown that cannabis reduces the amount of time that a person spends in deep sleep, also known as REM sleep periods, which actually makes them less rested when they wake up, feeling more drowsy and tired and out of sorts the next day. It permeates that cycle of feeling exhausted while they're awake. 38% of youth that use cannabis medically do so to treat symptoms of ADHD. However, what we know about cannabis and ADHD tends to suggest that the opposite effect may be more likely. Cannabis can cause surges of dopamine in the brain, which may make a person temporarily feel motivated and focused, which is a common need for individuals that live with ADHD. However, adolescent cannabis use can cause a brain to become tolerant to dopamine, which creates an even greater need to even feel close to the same effects, which actually worsens the symptomology of ADHD, especially when the person is not using. We also know that cannabis can impair the development of various regions of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum, and the hippocampus, which are responsible for learning and memory and focus and planning, all of which tend to make symptoms of ADHD even worse overall. Finally, we have pain. 27% of youth say they use cannabis to treat chronic pain, 23% treat acute. Now, medical grade cannabis, with supervision and measured use, may cause a reduction in swelling and improve responses to pain, but more research into why this happens is ongoing. And many studies published in the Canadian Medical Journal over the last number of years have actually suggested that cannabis's effects on pain are actually more like a placebo effect, meaning that the reason that they work with pain is that the person that's using really wants them to work on pain. So they believe that it helps. And furthermore, regular use of heavy cannabis products, like those bought for recreational use or that youth can get their hands on from a dealer, that tend to have far more THC versus a CBD leaning medical product, may actually cause what's known as cannabis induced hyperalgesia, which causes the body to actually become more susceptible to feeling pain. Now, I don't say all of this to say that cannabis lacks medical uses. That is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is the issue with self medication, the issue with using cannabis without consulting a healthcare provider greatly and drastically reduces the likelihood of positive outcomes. Cannabis has medical applications, recognized socially and in the medical field. But anyone thinking of using cannabis medically should treat it as any other medical product. If you are speaking with a youth, if you work with a youth, if you are a parent or a care provider, and you are talking to a youth that's struggling with their mental health, with their personal wellness, and they talk about using cannabis to alleviate those problems, it's important that they treat cannabis the way they would any other medication. They speak to a healthcare provider, they speak to a social worker, and they look for healthier and safer alternatives. The analogy I often use for teens is that using cannabis to self medicate without seeking medical support is kind of like hearing a noise in your car on the highway, so you turn up the volume on your radio. That may drown out the noise, but it doesn't necessarily fix the problem. Sure, the noise might go away, but eventually, if the problem's not resolved, it could result in greater damage to the car, which causes you more money and headaches at the mechanic shop. Similarly, using cannabis to cope with health complications without medical consultation may cause feelings or symptoms to subside, but the symptoms may also continue or even worsen in both the short and long term. All of this to say that anyone thinking of using cannabis to treat a medical issue should always first consult with a healthcare provider. Ooh, quite a mouthful there. Now, the human brain is considered fully or almost fully developed by what age? Is it 25, 21, 19, or 18? What do we think? Take a moment here. 25. The answer here is indeed 25. The other three ages are actually the legal age for cannabis use based on province in Canada. In Alberta, the legal age for cannabis use is 19. In most other provinces and territories, British Columbia, Ontario, Atlantic Canada, the average age is 19. In Quebec, the legal age was 18. But citing damages and potential risks to the adolescent brain, the Quebec government actually increased the age of legal use to 21. But it is 25, not any of those other age ranges, that is the age at which the brain is fully developed. And it begs the question, why do we say teens are more at risk of cannabis-related harms? If I ask kids this question, they kind of understand. They say, well, our brains are still developing. They say, what's that mean? Well, our brains are still developing. What's that mean? Well, it means our brains are still developing. It means something a little more. And here's what it means. Cannabis use can impact the brain's ability to form connections during adolescence. This is called myelination. It's the idea of strengthening new connections in learning. It's when our brain continues to do an action, when we practice a new skill, when we practice a new behavior, our brain actually connects to that through a process called myelination, and it strengthens the process. Now, when a person uses cannabis, this can actually accelerate sort of gray matter thinning in the brain and reduce the sort of rate and strength at which new ideas and concepts are myelinated, which makes it harder for young people to learn new information. It also increases the rate at which the brain discards existing connections. This is called synaptic pruning. This can lead to issues with memory. This is why youth that use cannabis tend to struggle more with learning and retaining new information. And again, because THC can accelerate the thinning of gray matter, and this risk is heightened based on age, what we do know is that thinning gray matter is actually linked to psychological disorders, including bipolar schizophrenia and psychosis. Now, second, the increased release of dopamine in the brain that we've talked about a few times can elevate the risk of harm to a youth's mental well being. And you might say, well, how? They're getting a rush of excitement. The problem is the overactivity of dopamine in the brain can actually sort of um, become associated with an increased risk in not only psychotic episodes in cannabis, especially when that overaction of dopamine tends to happen closer to the back of the brain, which tends to be the region of the brain where we start to see psychological conditions and effects and symptoms kind of manifest and be found. But the second issue is that regular use of cannabis, that regular push to try to acquire and release more dopamine in the brain can actually create a tolerance and a dependence to use cannabis. This is why teens that use cannabis while their brain is still developing are actually twice as likely as adults to develop a cannabis use disorder as those that start using after the age of 25. Which of the following skills can be affected by THC from cannabis? Is it judgment, memory, decision making, managing emotion, all of the above? What do we think? I'll give you a moment to think about this one. All the above. This one is indeed all of the above. Look, there are people that are going to use cannabis. There are clients you're going to work with. There are teens in your life. There are kids that you know. There are peers that you know that are going to use cannabis that will never experience significant harm. That is absolutely true. It is also absolutely true that there are those who will. The short-term risks of cannabis to the brain include things like dizziness and confusion, anxiety, panic attacks, difficulty with concentration, as well as a reduction in things like reaction time and coordination. Many of these skills are important for things like learning new information in school, completing tasks at work, driving a vehicle, or operating machinery. Now, the long-term risks of cannabis use on the brain can include struggling with memory and focus, impairment to decision making and problem solving, as well as issues with depression, anxiety. We do see a correlation, whether there's a causation, there's being more research required, between cannabis use and increased suicidal ideations. And we do also see a connection between cannabis as well as psychosis and schizophrenia, particularly for youth that begin using during their adolescence. Just as I mentioned that the medical properties and potential uses of cannabis do remain largely unknown, and we're still learning, the health risks of cannabis also remain largely unknown because long term research has not existed or been credited until recently, due to the sort of 80 to 90 years we spent with cannabis being largely illegal in Canada and the United States. However, new data shows that cannabis use can increase the risk of heart disease and stroke, impair brain development, and may contribute to both anxiety and depressive disorders. Now, heavy and regular use of cannabis, a sort of a little known fact, may actually contribute to a response in the body known as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. This is whereby an individual actually experiences extreme nausea and cyclical vomiting, meaning that they throw up even 5 times an hour. Some people with CHS actually may report vomiting as much as 20 to 40 times a day. This is caused by regular, usually daily, heavy use of cannabis products. Now, this inability to hold down water or hold down food can cause significant weight loss, can cause dehydration, and in some cases may result in hospitalization due to renal kidney failure. Now, the only known treatment for individuals experiencing cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome is an alleviation of the symptoms maybe caused by them using calamine lotion or showers, because those sort of receptors in the body that respond to pain are constantly being stimulated, which causes them to feel this sort of constant creeping sensation on their skin. So they start to use calamine or bathing in hot water to make that feeling go away. But the only known way to really treat and get rid of CHS is for the person to quit using. But the problem is, when they stop using, the symptoms actually tend to get worse because they're going through cannabis withdrawal. And this period of worsening can last for some people 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or even 12 weeks. And for those that do quit using, quitting permanently may be necessary because people that live with CHS or have experienced it once are at a greater risk of experiencing it again. Now, teens that use cannabis are at an 11 times higher rate of developing a psychotic disorder compared to those who do not. This based on a 2024 CAMH report that looked at sort of the research and sort of instances and incidences of schizophrenia and psychosis and other psychotic disorders since about 2007, 2008, particularly looking at youth. In fact, in February 2025, Ottawa Hospital and the ICES reported that the proportion of new cases of schizophrenia associated with cannabis use disorder had risen from 4% before legalization to 10% after the legalization of cannabis in Canada, and that the overall contribution of cannabis use disorder to new schizophrenia cases has actually nearly tripled in the last 18 years. Now, we do also know that THC use is associated with an increased risk of heart attack and heart disease because cannabis can actually change blood flow, it can change blood pressure, and it can change heart rate, which can contribute to things like arrhythmia, dizziness, fainting, and for individuals with cardiac histories, this may result in significant cardiac-related episodes. We have seen an increase in myocardial infarction and heart disease in adults under the age of 40, and cannabis has actually been cited as a risk factor for these. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the National Drug Driving Study of 2024, conducted in British Columbia, actually found that cannabis edged out alcohol as the most common substance found in dead and injured drivers in Canada. Whew. Lots of stuff to process tonight. Now, we're coming into the home stretch. I know we've got about 7 minutes before we hit the top of the hour. So I do want to leave you with this as sort of a parting thought when we look at cannabis. At what point does substance use become a problem? At what point does it become an issue? Sometimes when we do presentations on substance use, there's this belief that all substance use is bad. It comes from this pre-existing notion of abstinence-only approaches. The thing with substance use is that it doesn't start as an immediate problem, but it becomes one for many people. It absolutely has capacity to. And we're going to talk about what that looks like. Substance use exists on a spectrum. On the left-hand side of the spectrum, and this is where I do have to say something for abstinence-based programming, there is non-use. People that don't use substances are not at risk of harm. If I don't smoke cannabis, if I'm not inhaling secondhand smoke, I'm not at risk of any lung illnesses if I have susceptibility to. If I'm not vaping, I'm not at a risk of cannabis-induced psychotic episodes. There is truth to that. That is where the merit of abstinence comes in. The issue with abstinence is 20% of people are still choosing to use, even though they were taught this for 40 years. So just say no, it didn't really work. There are people that use substances for benefit. Cannabis has medical application. It has industrial application. In fact, the cannabis market here in Canada generates billions of dollars for medical research through its sale, through its excise sales, through its taxes. And the prescribed legal use of cannabis can have positive health, social, or spiritual effects when done with medical consultation and supervision. Now, that being said, all cannabis use does contain some degree of risk. For some people, that can be quite low. People that designate a sober driver, people that avoid mixing with other substances, people that look for lower potency products, they may still be at risk of some adverse effects. Maybe they'll get high and say something they didn't intend to say. Maybe they'll get high and sleep in the next day. Maybe they'll feel a little bit of nausea. Maybe they'll throw up once in a while. This doesn't mean they're addicted. It just means they experienced a low risk. It didn't change their life, create some discomfort or harm. Problematic use is where we start to see these things evolving. Someone starts to use more frequently. They start to use almost every day. They get behind the wheel of a car and drive. This is where we've had a problematic event. They mix with alcohol. They mix with opioids, which can create significant risks and harms. And finally, where we see addiction or disordered use, this is a treatable medical condition whereby the person continuously uses even while experiencing these harms. Their grades are slipping at school because they're not going to class because they're high. They're cutting out of work early and getting fired from their job because they're showing up impaired. They're regularly operating a vehicle while impaired. They're breaking the law to get their hands on substance use or on substances like cannabis. This is where we see issues with dependency and with addiction. Now, people move back and forth between the stages of substance use over time. And every single individual in this world exists somewhere on the spectrum. There are those that never use. There are those that use with a medical license. There are those that use recreationally once in a while and have a great time without experiencing many harms. There are those that use recreationally once in a while and have negative experiences and then they don't use again. Everyone exists somewhere on the spectrum and they will move back and forth. But where we start to see people moving to the right-hand side, how can we tell there's a problem, is looking for certain signs. And the physical signs can include tolerance. If you know someone is using cannabis and you've started to notice that they've had to use more or switch to stronger products, to extracts, to vapes, to more edibles to feel the same effect, this is a tolerance. It means they have to use more to feel the same effects. If they start getting moody or anxious when they can't use, this is known as withdrawal. If you notice that their health is declining, even if they think it's not caused by the substance that they're using, if their mental health is deteriorating, if their cardiovascular health is deteriorating, if they start to experience regular creeping sensations in the skin, nausea, dehydration, vomiting, these things could be caused by cannabis. It's important they speak with a healthcare provider. Overconsumption and overdose. If they're using knowingly to the point of being sick, this is a sign of harmful use. Behavioral signs can include isolation. Again, someone starts to use because they're hanging out with their friends, then they're cutting out to use on their own. This is a sign of harmful use. They're prioritizing the substance over their loved ones. Falling into debt. We know the average teen in Canada, according to the Canadian Cannabis Survey, spends about $65 a month on cannabis. That's about $780 a year, just if we do quick math. $780 a year may not be a lot of money to someone that's working regularly. But to a teen, the idea of spending almost $800 a year on substances if they start using at 14 is $3,200 in cash by the end of high school. And if all of a sudden they're wondering why they can't afford a new console, why they can't afford to go out with their friends, why they can't afford to buy new clothes, why they can't afford to buy a new laptop when they're moving off to college university, why it is they have to actually accrue and save a little bit more money than they were before, this could be a sign of harmful substance use. Not just from cannabis, but others as well. Rule breaking, breaking the rules to get your hands on drugs or breaking rules while using. Declining performance can be a sign of harmful use. Problems with learning, new or worsening stress, anxiety, depression, intrusive or unfamiliar thoughts. This is where individuals start thinking things that they don't know why they're thinking them and they can't stop them from thinking. This can be a sign of a significant mental health disorder. If you ever are working with a youth and they mention that they're having thoughts that they don't understand and that they're struggling to come to terms with, this can be symptomatic of significant mental challenges. And it's very important that they get in touch with a social worker, with a social service provider that can help them process and understand these feelings and thoughts. Hallucinations, delusions, and mood swings can also be a sign. Now, we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I am going to allocate time as we do have this booked until the bottom of the hour. We will be wrapping up the webinar here in just a couple minutes, at which point I'll be wrapping up the recording, but I will stick around to answer questions that people have after. And before I do that, I do want to point out how we reduce risks of harm. When we look at cannabis, many people will choose not to use cannabis. That's a healthy approach. But for those that do, it's important we give them strategies to try to reduce the risk of negative outcomes. This is why we recommend limiting use or avoiding use prior to age 25. If they're going to wait to use, we recommend that they wait. This allows the brain to fully develop. We recommend they take breaks from substance use and that they plan sober events so that they can reduce if they're starting to develop a tolerance or needing more of a regular use. They start to take time away to reduce that tolerance, meaning that they don't need to use as much. They look for lower THC products. They avoid vapes and or synthetic cannabis. They avoid mixing alcohol with cannabis. I often say in other presentations, drinking alcohol is like having a really possessive best friend. Alcohol wants you to drink constantly, but it really doesn't want you to be around anybody else. Picture that very toxic friend that doesn't want you talking to anyone else. That's alcohol. Mixing alcohol with any other substance creates harm. Cannabis is no exception. Mixing alcohol with cannabis can increase the risk of poisoning. It can increase the risk of dehydration. It can worsen alcohol poisoning, greening out. It can increase hangover risk. It can increase burnout risk. It increases the risk of impaired driving. And even if you think of the side effects of both of these substances being used together, I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that cannabis is used medically is that it prevents nausea and vomiting. Well, if alcohol poisoning causes nausea and vomiting, then the use of cannabis may actually prevent some people experiencing cannabis poisoning from actually throwing up alcohol, which allows it to go deeper into the bloodstream and worsen the alcohol poisoning. This is why it's recommended if someone's smoking weed, they avoid drinking. If someone's drinking, they avoid cannabis. We recommend they designate a sober driver. We recommend that if they're using edibles, they start with a very small amount and wait to see how they feel for a couple of hours. We recommend they avoid using substances when do things that require focus or coordination. And finally, we recommend they treat medical cannabis the same as any other prescription. That means talk with your healthcare provider. If you're using cannabis medically, you get it from a regulated source. You wait until you're of legal age to use it. You use in such a way that you have supervision, you're monitoring your symptoms, and keeping up to date with your healthcare provider if they are changing. Now, I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight, and you will find various resources on our website to further the conversation on cannabis. And you can visit our website. I believe my outreach officer, Sarah, there can post that into the chat panel, which is talksubstance.org. But I will also ask, I have a lovely little post-workshop survey here. I'm going to toss a link into the chat panel. If you want to take a minute and fill it out, I would be very, very grateful. For those of you that joined tonight, I want to thank you for coming out. And for those of you that are watching online, we certainly hope that you've enjoyed the recording and that you've learned something. I will at this time be stopping the recording, so I'd like to thank you all. Hope that you enjoy your evening. And for those that are staying here in person, feel free to ask any questions that you have. And everyone else, take care. All the best.